Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Positive Leadership Podcast. Today, I'm truly thrilled to welcome someone whose pioneering ideas have reshaped the global sustainability conversation for over 4 decades. He's often referred as the Godfather of Sustainability, a title that is well earned, actually. He coined the triple bottom line, changing the way businesses and leaders measure success and shifting focus from profit only to a broader concern for people, for the planet, and the performance as well. Many of you are maybe familiar actually with his extensive body of work, including a number of fantastic books such as The Zero Notes, Green Swans, and The Tickling Shocks. His influence stretches across industries, and his call for regenerative capitalism continues to challenge the status quo. So I'm very honored and excited to welcome John Elkington. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today, John. A warm welcome.
Philippe, it's a great pleasure to see you again and to be in this conversation. So back to you.
Thanks so much, John. So, John, before we get into your pioneering work that I was referring to, what I love to do usually to start about your personal journey, something that we often explore on the podcast to understand what shapes leaders, basically. So could you take us back to your early years and what was your family environment look like? And how did those early experiences maybe planted the seeds for the values and conviction that later drove, your mission in sustainability for life?
Well, my wife of 57 years now says that she periodically has referred to me as a missionary, and she doesn't mean that kindly. So I'm always a bit nervous about talking about a sense of mission, and I'll answer the question, but
yes,
I'm also now 75, and I'm actually feeling I'm only just getting started. So although I'm happy to go back into the history, I think the period ahead of us, next 10 to 15 years, is going to be utterly extraordinary. Perhaps we can come back to that. But I was brought up traveling. My father was a Second World War fighter pilot. He was in the Battle of Britain. He stayed on with the Air Force. We traveled with him as a family. And so I didn't really come back to my country until I was 9 years old. So in some ways, I've always felt not exactly an alien in my own country, the United Kingdom, Britain, England, whatever we call it. But there's been this sort of slight displacement. And then when I became an environmentalist in the late 1960s, that didn't help either because, my parents' generation really didn't know what to make of that. And it took my father in particular probably 25 years to really get his brain around what I was doing. And he thought I should be a merchant banker. I should go into investment banking. I should go into the armed forces. I should do something grown up that he would recognize. And then you kindly mentioned the books, but one of them, which was published in 1988, which I did with a colleague, Julia Hales, called The Green Consumer Guide.
Yes.
Sold 1 million copies in 18 months. And he suddenly understood
what
it was we were trying to do. So in a way, to your question, I've never had a career. So people ask me for careers advice, and I say, I'm the last person to ask for that because I've never either properly understood what I was meant to be doing. And I think perhaps that is the role of a pioneer. You keep pushing ahead of the herd into areas where no one really knows what you should be doing or how to do it. And in a way that just finally, it suits my personality because in many ways, by the time I get to the point where I think I know what I'm meant to be doing and how to do it, I want to be elsewhere. I want to know what I don't know how to do and I have to work that out along the way. But so I think younger years had a big influence on me. But I think growing up with the environmental movement was probably the biggest influence on my interests and priorities.
And can you actually illustrate what this environmental movement culture was developing at the time? Because I think it's pretty hard for people today in 2025 to understand the conversation we are having like 50 years plus ago.
Well, it's funny because nowadays people say I'm an environmentalist, and that's a badge
Yes.
of pride. Back 50 years ago, and where I was very unusual among environmentalists and Greens, because I was trying to engage the world of business, and if you were engaging business at that stage, so this is the 1970s, they quite literally thought if you were an environmentalist, you were actually a communist. I mean,
A communist.
these things were completely interchangeable. Um, but to your question, to me, one
Mm,
of the absolute turning points in my thinking was 1970,
mm,
when Earth Day happened, and I happen
yes.
to know the founder of Earth Day, Dennis Hayes, now
Mm,
quite well, and but at that time, they got 20 million Americans out on the streets protesting around environmental issues. And because of that, when Richard Nixon took over as president, he
mm,
had no option but to set up the Environmental Protection Agency, launched the National Environmental Policy Act. All of these different things started to happen because of this real sort of public
mm,
uh, pressure. But nonetheless, for many years afterwards, people in business just felt, we really don't want to talk to these people. If we let them in the
yes.
front gate or the front door, they'll just go for our throat. Um,
Yes.
and so a lot of my early work was trying to relax people,
Mm,
and maybe I was a Trojan horse in some ways. I mean, I was male, I was white, I had a sort of a sensible accent, all the rest of it, and I could talk as if I was an economist, or as if I was an engineer, or I was an accountant, or whatever. So a lot of that early phase was just getting people into a conversation
mm.
because that hadn't existed before. One tiny final thing, which is when I
Yeah.
came to
Yeah.
the field. I worked with, for example, some of the founders of the World Wildlife Fund, Max Nicholson, Peter Scott, and so on,
Mm,
and they were conservationists. Now,
mm,
before conservationists, active management of habitats to preserve
mm,
species, there was preservation. Let's lock up
mm.
areas, the world into
Yeah.
national
To
parks.
protect. Yes.
Then came the conservationists, then came the environmentalists, then came the Greens, then came everybody, the sustainability movement. And many of these different groups really didn't know how to talk to each other. And when I uh, think back to the conservationists I work with, they were often hunting, shooting, and fishing people, as we would say. And the
Yeah.
environmentalists were absolutely none of that. And so the
Yeah.
conservationists would look at the environmentalists and say, you're anti-growth, you're anti-profit, you're anti-business, you're anti-everything. And it wasn't entirely true, but that was, again, a set of internal
Yes.
divides that I had to negotiate.
Yeah, it's actually quite fascinating to think about what has changed. We'll come back to the conversation, John,
Mm.
over the past 50 years in terms of the mindset of the people across corporates, across consumers, citizens, across politicians as well. So more to come, because first of all, I'd like to go back to your studies. You
Mm.
pretended you're not an economist, but I know for a fact you did some economic studies, right? And and my understanding actually is that you mentioned that certain economic thinkers, such as Joseph Schumpeter and Nikolai Kondratiev,
Yeah.
shaped your understanding of business and innovation in the early days. And you are drawn to Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction and Kondratiev's ideas around long economic cycles. So, what was it about that work that captured your imagination at the time? And how did it influence your understanding of the long term cycles of innovation and change in capitalism?
Well, unlike you, Jean-Philippe, I've never been a mathematician. And therefore, although I've helped found 4 businesses now, and they all still exist since the late 70s. Um, I've always been blind to a balance sheet. I know when things go black or red, I can sort of tell what's going on, but I have an intuitive feel. But to your question, I went to university first time around to study economics because it seemed like a grown up thing to do, and I had liked economic history. I'd liked macroeconomics, but I really struggled with
Hmm.
microeconomics. So I tried it for a year, but that year was 1968. And as
Wow.
you may know, that was a year of
Yeah.
very significant disturbance where the baby boom generation really started to cut
Yes.
its teeth on activism. And I talked to my economics professors and said, look, you're not covering social and you're not covering environmental issues in the way that I think they should be taught. And at the same time, most of what you're doing is based on statistics, which I don't
Mm.
properly understand at all. So I dropped out after a year and went on to other things. But I look back at that period with,
Mm.
well, with sort of gratitude in some ways. But it's exactly as you referenced. Nikolai Kondratiev was the first one to engage
Mm.
me with this sort of thinking around long wave cycles, and you'll know the story that he ran a very prestigious institute in the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
but he told Stalin once something Stalin really didn't want to hear. So right in the heart of the depression, Kondratiev told Stalin that unlike the dictator believed, capitalism was flat in its face at that point, but would come back stronger. And so he's put in a concentration camp for that
Mm.
and finally killed. And Schumpeter then picked up that torch and
Mm.
exactly as you said, these sort of ways of creative destruction. And I found that bigger narrative
Mm.
much more engaging because I'd always been fascinated by history too and the cycles of history. So in a way, I think the reason I look back at that period of my education with great gratitude is it wasn't the intent of my economics professors to expose me to that stuff.
Yeah.
But at
Yeah.
that time, they hated Kondratiev and they hated Schumpeter. But and also go in cycles and they come back into fashion in a way.
Yeah. No, I mean, very interesting actually to hear about kind of your core background, core beliefs that you started to shape early on and that you revisited, I guess, year after year, John. Now, moving from your academic influences to the moment when you realize, again, as your wife said, I guess, that you're a missionary and focus on sustainability. I had on this podcast a number of purpose-driven leaders, such as Paul Pullman, that I'm sure you know
Yes,
well,
I love
of
him.
course, who and we described again during our discussion a tipping point when his professional ambition and social impact aligned in his life. So, was there for you, John, a particular event or moment when you knew that sustainability would be the focus of your work? And was there a pivotal encounter, crisis, or project maybe that set you on this path?
Oh, Jean-Philippe, that's a difficult question to ask because the simple answer is no. I don't think there was any
Hmm.
one moment where I felt I'm going to be what I am now. I don't think that ever crystallized in that
No.
way. But there were moments, as your question suggests, where a wider world and the future crashed into my consciousness, crashed into
Hmm.
my and I mentioned that my father was a pilot, so for example, flew the monitoring missions around the British H-bomb tests on
Yep.
Christmas, and he was away for 4 or 5 months. So I was sort of left as a 6, 7 year old to sort of do what I liked. And one night I was coming back from having supper with an Irish farm labourer and his family completely on my own. There was no moon, so it was completely dark. And I was walking between these areas where there were great ponds where they used to grow flax and then soak flax to create linen and so on. And I suddenly found myself completely surrounded by things like snakes wriggling. I mean, tens of thousands of them.
Yeah.
And they were baby eels. And I
Yeah.
put my fingers down, and the eels were going through my fingers, and I had a moment of complete and utter shock, and then it's very odd, but a sense of complete and utter connection. So this was
Hmm.
7 probably,
Yeah.
and that has always lived on with me. But the following day, this was in Northern Ireland. My father would never live on Air Force bases, so we always lived in the community, which at times in places like Northern Ireland and Cyprus was quite dangerous.
Yeah.
Um, but then he sent us to a Catholic convent school, and we were Protestants. So three Protestant children in a Catholic convent
Wow.
school. So you can perhaps do this sort of emotional and political dynamics. And the next morning I went in, and this was all embedded in a Protestant
Yeah. Yeah.
town in Northern Ireland. I went in and I asked Mother Superior, do animals go to heaven? And her response was absolute outrage. And I've said it a number of times,
Wow.
but I only know what she said to me because that afternoon I went home to talk to my mother and said,
Yeah.
what do the words mean? And Mother Superior said, and I won't do the accent or whatever, and I won't do the outrage, but you're either a pagan, somebody who sacrifices animals and all the rest of
Yeah.
it in dark woods and so on, or
Yeah.
you're a pantheist, somebody who believes in the life and spirituality being invested in everything. And she
Yes.
said, I don't know which is worse, but she became so angry that in that
Wow.
moment, any religious faith that I may have had
Yes.
went
Yes.
completely out the window. And
Huh.
I've always felt that, in a way, the structure of environmentalism, which is about something bigger than us, the planet, which we saw
Yes.
from outside in the late 60s, which is another turning point for me. But other lives and lives that go on after ours, other afterlives, if you like. There is something of a sort of
Hmm.
quasi-religious structure to environmentalism. So I don't know whether that's why I embraced it. I suspect not. I just like nature. I like wildlife,
Yeah.
and so. But that for me was a
Well,
pivotal point.
I love those two stories, John. I think you tell a lot. You tell a lot, and I think, I mean, I would almost dare using the word religious and not just a missionary, right? Because you talked about faith and religion in
Yeah.
nature in a way, as your story relates actually your life when you are just 7 years old, and the way your mind, your body basically captured that moment in
It was
yourself.
it was it was challenging too, Jean-Philippe,
Yeah.
because even at that age, I was becoming very uncomfortably aware
Mm.
of the divisions between religions, even in that case between different forms of Christianity. And we went to Cyprus and we went to Israel, and everywhere we went, religion was an excuse
Mm.
for people to be, tribal and to oppress other people.
Yeah.
So but equally, I'm nervous about spirituality because that there's a whole lot of baggage that comes with that. But it is about a worldview. It is about what you take to be your position in this wider universe of ours. And
Yes.
I think that anchoring has always served me very, very well when I'm in boardroom situations or similar
Mm.
things where people are challenging me back. Because you have to have some sense, as you will well know,
Mm.
of who you are and what you really think is important. Otherwise, you're just
Yes.
swept every which way by the political.
Clearly. No, thanks, John. So let's keep going through your journey. And, as I said before, you've been writing a lot of books that have inspired transformation from deep inside corporate boardrooms. We'll come back to some of those conversations to the everyday lives of citizens.
Hmm.
You actually mentioned a book that I was going to ask you a question about. This incredible book, The Green Consumer Guide, that you co authored with Julia Hales back in 1988. That book was not just a bestseller with more than 1 million copies, I guess many more today, John. It became a cultural moment, and it sparked a shift in consciousness and helped ignite the green consumer movement as well at a time when few people were actually thinking that way. Here we are, more than 3 decades later. Consumer awareness is arguably higher, but so is the complexity also of the climate
Yeah,
and social challenges that we have to face. So I'd love to ask you, if you look back at the impact of the Green Consumer Guide,
yeah.
what do you feel has genuinely changed actually in the way people consume today? And if you were to write that guide now in 2025, what would be your top three must do for a truly responsible, conscious, ethical consumer, John?
The top three. Well, let me just go back to the early part of the
Yes.
question. first, and you kindly seemed to suggest that I knew what I was doing when I did the book. What happened was I suddenly got this phrase "green consumer" in
Mm.
my mind, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do a green consumer guide? And some environmentalists at that stage were quite anxious about that, quite agitated. They felt it was a bad thing to put green and consumer together. But for whatever reason, as a marketing, as a branding
Yeah.
exercise, it worked remarkably well. And I would not have done the book that we did, Julia and I, without her input, because she constantly, I was going to write a book about the issues
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
And she said, but let's just think about the woman who helps her mother in
Mm.
the house. How does she think when she goes to the supermarket or into the pharmacy, into the chemist? What's she actually looking for? And what information does she actually want? So we
Yeah.
wrote the book in that way. And to your question, well, it sold 1 million. It must have sold a lot more now. No, because what happened was the book had such an impact. In 3 months, the
Yeah.
Financial Times covered it 12 times.
Wow.
And companies were just reeling all over the place because
Yeah.
what had happened was they were used to dealing with regulators and
Yeah.
policymakers in
Mm.
places like Brussels and Washington, D.C. and Canberra
Yeah.
and so on.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, out of complete left field, consumers switched on, which these companies had never expected, these brands had never expected.
Hmm.
And at that stage, I literally thought, this is not a made-up stride. I thought I had a small consultancy then, and I
Yeah.
thought its business would be destroyed utterly. I didn't think any company would want to work with us after we did that book. What we found was completely the contrary.
Hmm.
And you mentioned Paul Pullman a moment ago. I mean, we had Unilever and Procter and Gamble literally slugging it out on our doorstep as to who would work with us because
Yeah.
we were very small. We weren't going to do Chinese walls. We're going
Yes.
to take one company, not others. So we started off working with Procter and Gamble, then much
Mm.
later started to work with Unilever, and
Mm.
so the book. And another thing I should say is, again, you're very kindly suggesting that we sort of change the world. What I have a talent for, if I have a talent for anything, is sensing when things are in the process of changing.
Mm.
And
Mm.
I had a feeling since 1986 that there was a big uh, wave of consumer interest and
Mm.
concern building, and we
Yeah.
played that, caught that
That
wave.
wave. Yeah.
So if I was thinking about three things
Three
now
things. Yeah.
that we'd encourage people to think through, some of these things are quite obvious. Now, I'm going to say what I'm going to say because at 50 years I've been a vegetarian, but I'm not going to tell people to eat no meat. But if you look at the impact on tropical deforestation, you look on the
Yeah.
climate related emissions and so on, meat consumption
Mm.
is a really, really major headache. And
Yeah.
we've got to somehow deal with that. Now, over time, I think cell culture and
Yeah.
precision fermentation and these new technologies will provide ways to create meat-like or fish-like or whatever it
Right.
is, proteins, and
Mm.
that'll be great. But if you're a meat eater still, anything you can do to reduce your consumption, firstly, and anything you do to make that consumption link out to, for example, organic
Yep.
agriculture, that's well worth doing. A second area, look,
Mm.
I drive a Tesla, and I look at what Elon Musk has
Still
been doing.
today, despite what's going on in the world, you're not one of the people
Even I
destroying your
feel
Tesla.
tempted to take a hammer to my own Tesla. But nonetheless, I mean, I look back at
Yeah.
what Elon Musk did, and I was working with Ford at the beginning of this century. And I
Mm.
remember in about 2004, 2005, sitting down with a group of 20 Ford Motor Company
Mm.
engineers and saying, there's this really interesting little company out there, Tesla, and there's this guy, Elon Musk. What do you think of him? And the answer was, oh, we tried electric cars 100 years ago. Didn't work then. It's not going to work now. So, no, I'm going to say, in
Yeah.
whatever you do, go electric.
Yes.
Um, but don't assume that by buying an electric car, particularly a sport utility vehicle like the one I
Yeah.
drive around, that you're actually saving the planet, because you really are not.
Mm.
Nonetheless, if you're going to have a private motor car,
Mm.
then having an electric one makes a bunch of sense.
It's a
But
good
if you
move. Yeah.
can, and I live in London,
Yeah.
and we have extraordinary public transport
Yes.
system and so
Yeah.
on. Wherever you can use public transport and all the rest of it.
Use it. Yeah.
That would be the second one.
That's a good one.
And walk and cycle. I mean, I'd say
Yes.
that I was a London cyclist for 45 years. I was knocked off my bike and left
Mm.
unconscious 4 times, uh, twice with 3 broken ribs. So it's an adventure at times, but do cycle and do walk if you possibly can. The third thing
Yep.
I would say is to be open minded and to be curious and to
Mm.
constantly ask questions about what you are buying, where
Mm.
it's come from, what sort of brands are associated with it, what companies stand behind those brands, what their policies are. Now, you can't ask everyone to do this every time they
Sure.
go to a
Yeah.
supermarket or dial up Amazon or whatever. But where you can, this is still the third point, where you can, ask questions of companies, and you will know. It's like sort of
Yeah.
members of parliament. They get very small numbers of letters now. If they get one, they think probably there are another 50 people who think the same thing. And it's the same with businesses. If you ask questions, it can sometimes have a disproportionate impact. But stay curious to
Yeah.
channel Steve Jobs, um, and keep learning, because this agenda is changing the whole time. And there are
So
moments where
much.
we're doing
Yeah.
the right thing, and
Yes.
suddenly we find we're not. And then the reverse happens as well. You're told not to eat butter for generations, then you're suddenly
Yeah.
told that is perhaps not such a bad thing.
No, thanks a ton, John, for sharing your top feelings, which I love because it's a combo of, I would say, really the right hygienes in your life, but also about this perpetual curiosity about new practices, new ways of doing things the right way, actually. And maybe the news of the days of the weeks as we record this episode, of course. Uh, we've got a big tariff war happening in the world, right? Maybe this is going to help. Who knows?
Well,
In
if
the
I
right
were
or the
to,
wrong way.
yeah, but if I were to sort of go for a fourth thing,
Yeah.
I'd say be very careful about where your money goes, whether
Yes.
that's the banks you're
Yep.
saving or borrowing from, whether it's your pension fund that you're involved in or whatever. And I think that's harder to get at. It's more challenging, as I found to my cost. But on the other hand, if you can shift the thinking of the people who manage your money, that's enormously important as well.
That's a great addition, actually, to your list. I love it as well. So, John, today we are seeing a new generation. Sociologists call them Gen Z. There's a new, also Alpha generation coming up now, who are deeply values driven. They are
Yeah.
not just making different consumption choices, they are using their voices, their platform, their network to push for change. We are seeing digital activism on TikTok, on Instagram, where accountability and transparency are being demanded at a scale that we've never seen before. So, how do you see this wave of digital activism influencing or not the corporate world and the consumer trends?
Well, I think the generational dynamic is immensely important. So I was a baby boomer, and many people now say the baby boomers were environmentalists. No, they weren't. I mean, there was a proportion of them who had environmental concerns, but most of them became consumerist citizens. But I mean, their lifestyles were not remotely sustainable. And when I look at these younger generations coming
Yeah.
through, I love them to pieces. I do not envy them their
Mm.
challenges at all, in the sense that climate chaos is building all around us. The loss of species and biodiversity is just off the scale
Yeah.
awful, and that's before you even start to factor in the growing likelihood of major conflict. Um, and the fact that even when these young people get out of their universities and so on,
Mm.
AI may have chewed up a large part of
Right.
the opportunity space for them. On the other hand,
Mm.
I've often been asked, when was younger people say, I just wish I'd been around for the golden age of sustainability. And my response is, we haven't had it yet. We really haven't had it yet. It is probably going to come. And you
Yes.
may well find yourself as part of all of that. In which case,
Mm.
not only do I envy you that being part of this sort of wave of solutions, but how can I help? And I think one
Yeah.
of the problems that we have now is
Mm.
I look at people who are my age and often younger, but certainly older, and people are saying, we were environmentalists. No, they weren't. We tried. No, they really didn't. Now we're just going to retire and hand over to the younger people. And I just think that's so self-serving and so dangerous. And I think what
Yes.
they've got to really think through is how do they help with their money, with
Mm.
their influence, with their volunteering
Yep.
capacity and so on. The people who've now got to really make this work in very different ways. I
Mm.
think that generational piece, which is you've mentioned, is enormously important. Just a final point: I don't
Yep.
think that each of these new generations is as seized with the
Mm.
value that we care to focus on as
Mm.
we might imagine. At least in my experience. I mean, I get a
Yes.
very particular take of younger people because they're naturally selected to be
Of
interested
course.
in all sorts of
It,
issues. What just finally, sorry, but it's just the
yeah.
thing that really worries me is I see this eco anxiety. I see people
Yeah.
really not only worried about climate change and all the rest of it, but losing patience with democracy, just feeling
Right.
democracy cannot solve these problems. And
Yeah.
I think that is deadly dangerous. So we've got to move very fast indeed to build bridges between the generations and give people real, well founded hope.
Yes. No, I'm with you, John. I think this is the biggest danger of our democracy these days. Now, coming back to the additional question I had in my question, I'm sorry, because I often ask a couple of questions in one. I was curious to see your from your bridge, the way you see digital activism helping or not,
Yeah, I missed
basically the
that.
sustainability journey, and where it can help yourself and others, and where maybe it actually play against it.
Well, I think digital activism is a lovely idea. Almost picking up on the tone of your earlier question, um, which I didn't consciously forget. I just forgot.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I think digital activism and the different platforms that have come up in that space are really quite useful. But I also think they're a distraction often. I think that they
Hmm.
give people a sense that they can press a button, they can fill in their name, they can send off an email or whatever it is.
It's
Job
done.
done.
Yeah.
And most of these sort of electronic polls are meaningless when it comes through to
Hmm.
politicians in their day-to-day tasks trying to decide whether they back a particularly controversial project or not. I mean, it will factor in. I'm not saying don't do it,
Hmm.
but don't assume that by doing
It's
uh,
enough.
form
Yeah.
of digital activism, you saved the world because you really haven't even begun
Hmm.
on that journey. With the greatest of respect. The other thing I think is that AI. I mean, like you, I use AI in different ways every day.
Yep.
Some of it's conscious, some of it's not. And I think what's beginning to happen is that what we um, prioritize online is now being built into the shape of the digital environment in which we operate. So whether
Hmm.
it's Amazon or whatever it is, knows who we are, knows what we want. And so whether we're conscious of it or not, we're sending invisible signals to that electronic ecosystem the whole time. And I
Yes.
think we have to become very much more conscious about how that is happening and what the impacts might be. And it's very difficult for any one citizen or user of all of this to know. I mean,
Hmm.
I struggle with it. But as AI really picks up speed and starts to become, I mean, I just find almost on a daily basis, I'm struck by the evolution of these chatbots and other things that I
Yes.
use. It's both incredibly exciting and it's quite terrifying at
Yes.
the pace of all of this. So uh, digital activism really important, but actually get out into the streets, and sometimes that's ignored as well. But I think physical protests where people, turn up, really important as well.
With so basically show and manifest your voice with your feet as well, and
Yeah,
joining movement and forces where with a
And
community of
also,
people, you can voice concerns. Yeah.
yeah, Jean-Philippe, I think it's also, I was with a younger person the other day, and he was saying he'd suddenly realized that making assertions, telling people, being
Mm.
expert is not the way to drive real change, and that
Mm.
you really need to ask questions, but they have to be
Yes.
well informed questions. And I think that that capability is something we've got to really help every age group, not just young people, to get their brains around and practice more effectively.
No, absolutely. And we will come back to AI a bit later in the
Okay.
episode, if you don't mind, John. So, in a previous episode with Anna Ritchie, that I think you know, she's an
Yes, I do.
environmentalist and a data scientist as well. We discussed the importance of understanding the numbers behind environmental challenges to drive concrete and effective actions.
Yeah.
Anna emphasized that best practices rely on decisions which are informed by accurate data, which makes
Yeah.
a lot of sense to me, which is exactly, I think, what your work has been about, at least, and we'll come back to that with a triple bottom line in a moment. So, from your own perspective, John, how can companies leverage data and transparency to actually accelerate the shift towards, again, a more sustainable future?
So I think what Hannah Ritchie has been doing is immensely important. And I think data and information and intelligence and ultimately wisdom, absolutely crucial. That whole spectrum, I think, is important. And when I first started off, the first company I co-founded with some of the founders of World Wildlife Fund was called Environmental Data Services.
Mm.
What we were looking at is trying to break into the world of business to understand what companies were doing on safety, health, and environment, where the information just didn't exist. Governments
Yep.
didn't know it, companies didn't know it either. So now we're in a period where many of those companies and many of them that have popped up since that we had never even imagined at that stage have chief sustainability officers. So these people are doing wonderful work, and I seem to hear that there were about 6,000 of them around the world. I don't know what the number
Mm.
is, but it's a lot of them. But I keep telling these people that the next phase in all of this is going to be centrally about data.
Mm.
It's centrally about the quality of data and not just how it's produced, because we
Yep.
have tens of thousands of companies now almost being forced to produce sustainability reports or ESG reports or whatever non-financial performance reports or
Mm.
whatever we call them. And the question I keep asking is, that's nice, and that's tackling the supply side. But what about the demand side? Who's actually
Mm.
using
Yeah.
that or those data in a way that helps direct our economies, our supply chain,
Yes.
all the rest of it, in a way that addresses some of our biggest challenges? And unfortunately, I think the answer is that's a howling gap in the
Yes.
market at the moment. So it's something we're going to have to address. And I would say that many of the chief sustainability officers I see at the moment are not as data savvy as I think the,
Right.
the, the next generation of those people will need to
Yes.
be.
No, I'm with you, John. I think there's a need actually for companies, for governments as well, obviously,
Yeah.
to not only dig into the data, but actually to really use the power of data with the right set of people, right set of skills and backgrounds to
Yeah.
truly inform decisions at the end of the day, and not just go on unknown places and take random decision based on opinions and lack of facts. So
Right, but
uh,
Philippe, if I may, just very quickly, I think one of the things that I learned very, very early in all of this in the 1980s was that data is absolutely crucial. But you've just as exactly you said, you've got to have the capability, the capacity to dig into where did the data come from and how has it been processed along the way. And the
yes.
moment where I really woke up to how important that was when for years, I think 7 years, the
Mm.
Nimbus 7 satellite had been flying over Antarctica. And as you will recall,
Mm.
it failed to spot the Antarctic ozone hole. It was balloons that went up that actually
Right.
saw the hole. And people then ask themselves, why did we not see the hole since we were flying over it the whole time? And the answer was when the data got back to Goddard Space Station, I think it was, they dumped it all because nothing like the hole had ever been
Yes.
imagined. Therefore, it wasn't possible. And I think with AI, we're going to have that problem in speed. We will have faith in AI, and yet
Yes.
I will. It's not just hallucination. It will just be feeding on flows of data and information, which are not necessarily always the ones that it should be feeding on. Anyway, back to you.
No, absolutely. I think a lot to discuss about real data insights and data wisdom, actually.
Mm.
Now, John, I'd love to talk about the role and the role you keep having with business leaders and corporates as well. So you had a huge impact advising a bunch of CEOs across the world and boards and sustainability. Some of the companies are making progress, but others are clearly stuck in old patterns as well. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a mixed bag, as you know well. I'd like you to share an example of corporate engagement where you saw a true transformation in a real way. And conversely, could you also describe a situation where you were disappointed by corporate, basically inertia or greenwashing? And I know that you are very diplomatic, John, so you may call out or not the names of the companies, but I think you've publicly shared some of those stories. So I'd love to pick two examples, maybe.
Well, in my most recent book, which you kindly mentioned, Tickling
Yeah,
Sharks, I do go into a number of the
you do,
things that went
absolutely.
well and some of the things that did not go quite so well. And I just, before I give you a couple of examples, I just say
Yeah,
something about the people that I've dealt with very few exceptions, have been intelligent people, committed people, well-trained people,
yeah.
with the sort of the interests of um, their their employees and their customers and their consumers and their investors very much in mind. So I'm not sort of saying that they were stupid. I'm not saying that they were idiotic. I'm not saying
Yes.
that they were villains or sort of
Hmm.
our enemy. They operated in a different reality. But if I give you two, and these will be slightly historic in the sense that
Hmm.
it's easier to talk about that. But we've talked about the Green Consumer Guide, but when that happened, several companies sued us. So
Hmm.
McDonald's sued us for 5 months,
Yes.
won that case. But there was a company then, like DuPont, called ICI,
Hmm.
UK company. And I was working with their chairman at the time, Sir John Harvey Jones,
Hmm.
completely unknown to him and completely unknown to each other, that three different businesses as part of ICI sued us: paints, garden chemicals, and PVC, I think. And we beat them off each time. But what that told me was that there was a company that was absolutely obsessed with what was happening in Brussels and
Hmm.
couldn't imagine consumers switching on. So that, in a way, is a bad case of you had
Yes.
a chairman, CEO, Harvey Jones, who really very thoughtful and quite imaginative on all these sorts of things. But he himself knocked back concerns around CFCs and ozone depletion and so on for several years because
Hmm.
it wasn't in the company's interest. Now,
Yes.
you continue to see that time and time again. But at exactly the same time, um, we when we were doing the Green Consumer Guide, it
Yeah.
had monstrous impact on a series of different companies. One of them
Hmm.
in Denmark was Novo Nordisk. Novo
Yes.
Nordisk, now known as sort of insulin producer and all of these sort of fat reduction
Yes.
injections and so on. But at the time, they're also in industrial enzymes, and the enzymes into applications like detergents. And we were saying those detergents with enzymes in it could promote skin sensitization and so on. As it happened, our data, our information was old.
Yeah. Hmm.
But their chairman, Mats Olafsson from Copenhagen, said he sent two of his people across to a conference where I was speaking in London
Hmm.
and said, just talk to John. And they said they came up after I spoke and said, would you come to Copenhagen and talk to our CEO? And I said, "Oh, President." I said, "Well, of course. I admire the company. I'd been tracking it for a while, but
Hmm.
we went." And Mads turned out to be an incredibly intelligent character, and later became a sort of professor at Copenhagen Business School and all sorts of other things. But he said, you can go anywhere you want in this company. You can talk to anyone you want to talk to. Come back and tell me what you find. And so Julia and I did that. I mean, we didn't do it immediately. We went back to London and we came back
Yeah.
prepared. And at the end of it, we came back and said three things. These three things we think you should do. One of which was invite in your worst enemies. I mean, the Greenpeace and people like that,
Yes.
because they were very active in genetic engineering. And we then led a series of annual engagement processes. And in the book, I tell the story of how some of those things went really well and some of them went appallingly badly. And I think one of the things as leadership in this space means
Yes.
not only having the courage, or in some cases perhaps the stupidity, to do things
Yes.
no one was prepared to do, but to stick with the right things and to pull back from some of the things that aren't working so well.
Yes.
And as far as you can, share what you're doing so others can learn and others can challenge what you're doing. And just, I'm talking about companies here, which other consultants would tend to say company X, company B, company A, whatever. We've signed non-disclosure agreements, but
Of course.
we've talked in public about what
Yes.
works, what doesn't. And I do
Yes.
that because I feel I've never felt I represent the sustainability world, the environmental movement, or the human rights movement, or whatever. I say,
Yeah.
if you want to know what those people think, let us pull them in
Let's invite them, yes, to
directly.
the table. Yes.
But it's been an odd game, and in a way, we've made up the rules as we went along, whether they're the right ones or not.
Yes.
They've mainly worked to date.
Yes. No, exciting stories. And for listeners, there's many more stories in John's books, particularly that one he was just mentioning, which are remarkable. I think beyond those big names of companies, John, and boards of companies, institutions in a way, there are people. And I know that I'm sure that you met with a number of people that we usually call leaders who set a different tone. And I had this opportunity with to us on my podcast a few months back, Laurence Toubiana, that I'm sure you know, who was the Sherpa, big Sherpa, behind Laurent Fabius for the famous Paris Agreement. Yeah. And she told me the story during the podcast, actually an unknown story, about the very last minute convergence of the agreement between people, which happened to be a very emotional moment, because literally, she told me, 1 hour before that was announced, there was a full disagreement between many parties. People were not ready to embrace the statement that was made 1 hour later, and she broke into tears. And people who saw her engaging for many years in shaping this process basically agreed on the very last minute to make it happen. So to me, it was a very telling story about the power of emotional intelligence on top, of course, of the rest, driving an incredible, I would say, agreement, consensus. So my question to you is, have you seen the same with some leaders as well, where the power of their thought leadership, emotion, and so on, inspiration have been driving their troops, their teams, and I'm talking about both institutions, governments maybe, but also corporates?
Well, the simple answer is time and again. So if you work closely with leaders, and I should just make the point, and you know it well, that leaders are not simply found in boards and C-suites and so on. They're throughout companies and all around them. And so we often find ourselves dealing with the very top level, top teams and so on. But we can't do that if we don't also know what the people elsewhere in the organization are thinking and what priorities they have. So when I think about somebody like Paul Polman, for example, I think he is a hero of many people in this space, and for very good reason. I think he's tried his absolute best, particularly in Unilever. But I first met him when he was in Procter and Gamble a very long time before that, and he was also in Nestle, I think. But what you see now with Unilever, and Unilever happens to be, I declare an interest. We're working with them again at the moment, but I started working with the company back in 1986 with the chairman of the Swiss and Italian companies. And at that stage, we were trying to get the board of Unilever HQ to pay attention to some of these sort of issues, which they certainly weren't terribly keen on doing. And when Paul came in, you see this agenda jumping up the priority list, and then you saw Paul pushed out, and you saw Heinz Schumacher coming in, and now you see Heinz Schumacher pushed out because Unilever isn't failing for whatever reasons to meet the market expectations. And so you've constantly got this tension between does what we're encouraging companies to do make them nicer people, but actually mean that they sacrifice market share or whatever else. And if that is the answer, then you have to be able to say, well, actually, that's not going to work terribly well. So you've got to continuously refine what you're doing and try and make sure that it actually helps people perform against a wider set of metrics. But I think one of the things that I've been very struck by is how since I started working with business sort of 45, 50 years ago, there have been probably 5 or 6 generations come through, because as you know, full well, a CEO level generation in business these days might be 5 or 6 years. So that churn has brought all sorts of younger people into senior roles, many of whom are much more open to the wider world than the people I started off having to deal with. But it doesn't guarantee that they understand. Well, they may understand the science, but they may be saying that's something for the policymakers to sort out, and then
not for me.
and then we'll all do it together. That leadership that we want to see, we ask people to demonstrate, it has proved particularly dangerous in the Trump era, where people are being told to strip out diversity, equity, and inclusion, and any mention to climate, even references now to women. If you've got that on your website, you're also under investigation. It's a very dangerous moment in all of that. But just one of the things I've been saying, and actually, it's not a fabrication. It's something I feel very strongly. I feel more energized now than I have done for 10 to 15 years, and I feel now it's really beginning. And the reason I'm feeling that is, it's not simply that the battle lines are drawn. It's simply that if you take ESG and you take CSR and all these different acronyms and shared value and all the rest of it, and you put them together, and everyone in business suddenly said, "Great, we'll do that," that would not have cracked the systemic challenges that we face. It would have made a good amount of progress, but it wouldn't have dealt with the systemic crisis that we face. And so now I think we've got. I'm not saying that Trump's shenanigans or outrages are a gift to the sustainability movement, but we should start to think of them that way. Now we've got to rethink, and very, very fast.
Yes. No, I tend to agree with you, John. I think this is probably the beginning of the new era with tons of challenges actually accelerating the opportunity in a way, in a crisper way for most people. In that context, I really love to ask you both actually the reason why you build that triple bottom line model, because that's to me has been a very important piece of work you did. And I'd like you to talk about not just the way you did and what it is. I'd like you to reflect triple bottom line today in 2025, at a time where you are advising many corporates, you're going into their balance sheet, as you said before. You've done some economics studies as well, despite the fact you said you are not an economist. You fully understand pretty well the economy. And you also believe in data, I think, and we shared that together previously. So I'd love you to walk us through the triple bottom line genesis a few years back, what it is, and if you could apply it today, the way you would apply it and the way you would advise, which I'm sure you do, boards and CEOs and CXOs of companies to apply that framework?
Well, I mean, firstly, thank you for the question. But secondly, when I came up with the triple bottom line, it was a real brain ache. This was back in 93, 94. It took me 18 months to get to that simple three-word formulation. And the reason why I was agitated at that time was that I had seen what was then, I think, the Business Council for Sustainable Development, now WBCSD, talking about eco-efficiency. So how do
Yeah,
we, as a business, make money or save money by doing the right thing on energy efficiency, waste management, pollution control, and so on? All great stuff. And if you're an engineer, it's
yeah,
just that's exactly how you want it framed. Or if you're an accountant or a chief financial officer,
yeah,
it helps as well. But I thought, well, there is this wider economic dimension. It's not just financial, and there's a social dimension, which is just completely not covered in all
yeah.
of this good stuff. And then one morning, I quite literally woke up with a triple bottom line in my brain, and I'd been helped with a younger colleague, Andrew Spencer Cook,
Mm-hmm.
and she and I just had this conversation for 18 months, and it took that somehow for the thing to
Mm-hmm.
crystallize. And at the time, I thought I've heard this phrase before. Somebody else has used it, and for years I tried to ask people, did you invent this? Where does this come from? Nobody had an answer, and no one claimed it. And then about 20 years after, so about 2014. I was reading through a book. I very rarely read books, but for the second time. But this was a book by Alvin Toffler, who did books like
Mm.
Future Shock. But he did a book called
Yeah.
The Third Wave, and I was skimming through it, and on about I don't know what it was, page 267, I came across a subtitle in a chapter, and it said multiple bottom lines, and
Mm.
that's where that came from. That's where the idea came from, because that was 1980 that came out.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It was 14 years later that I came up with the bottom line. Then to your question, for a period of time, maybe 2, 3 years afterwards, it was resisted. I even had somebody who joined our company, which was then sustainability, um, and he fought me for 18 months. He's a great friend. I mean, I love him to
Mm-hmm.
pieces. But he fought me for 18 months, saying he did not. He wanted to join an environmental
Yeah.
enterprise. It's not something that's going to do all of this other wild stuff. And then out of the blue, after 18 months, Shell came to us, and they've been trying to get us to work with them since 1995. So this must be 96, early 97.
Yeah.
They came to us and said, and we'd refused to work with them for 2 years because they'd had Brent Spar, major controversy. In Nigeria, they'd had the executions of Ken Saro-Wiwa and his colleagues.
Mm.
Um, and so we said we're not going to work with you, but they almost tricked us into working with them, and we helped them do the first ever triple bottom line
Mm.
report, People, Planet, Profit, and because it was Anglo-Dutch company, the
Mm.
Dutch then picked up on the three Ps, People, Planet, Profit, which I came
Yeah.
up with the following year, 1995, and from that it began to spread. It was sort of slow
Mm.
and steady, but then the Global Reporting Initiative picked up on the triple bottom line. The Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes again
Yes.
picked up on the triple, and so it got embedded in frameworks. And then the B Corp movement, which
Yes.
I've worked very carefully to try and support,
Yeah.
picked it up as well. So you now have more or less 10,000 companies doing things around that. But then ESG came along, and Paul Clements Hunt, who devised ESG, environmental, social, and governance investment, and all the rest of it, as you know. I consider him a friend, but I looked at the triple bottom line and ESG, and I thought, well, to my mind at least, with the triple bottom line, I would say this, wouldn't I? But there's a
Mm.
coherence, whereas because you have three forms of capital creation or value or wealth creation or destruction. You have
Yeah.
economic, social, environmental. And right, if you think of that as a triangle, in the middle, you can have things like education, governance, politics, whatever you want. ESG takes bits of that and other bits. And so I think ESG has been a useful provocation, but I'm not surprised now to see the level of pushback. And I don't think
Pushback.
either that it
Mm.
removes the need for the triple bottom line. And I certainly don't think sustainability is going to exactly
Yeah.
follow ESG into recession. So that was the arc. There's the one tiny thing that I should just say is just in 2018, I did through the Harvard Business Review, I did this product recall of the triple bottom line because
Yes.
I felt that it was being, it sounds arrogant,
Misused.
but misused,
Yeah.
abused, and people were using it as a balancing act, not as an integrating
Yes.
a framework for integration. And that provoked quite a response. But I think over time, very, very constructive set of responses. So I think it's
Yeah.
had a useful
So,
function in the wider world. I feel quite proud of it in a way, but in a way, it's almost like children. Then they go off and do what they do.
so
You can't claim any responsibility. Or
So, if I may, John, let me ask you a follow-up question on that. Actually, in order to prepare for the podcast, I had asked a couple of impact entrepreneurs to prepare a couple of questions, and I've got one of them who is a good friend of mine as well. His name is Mathieu Nebra. He's the co-founder of a French edtech company called Open Classroom,
Mhm.
which is a wonderful B Corp company and entreprise à mission, as we call it in France,
Yeah,
that makes education accessible to all. Okay. And
fantastic.
here's his question. He wonders what kind of shock is needed today to make companies systematically produce a triple bottom line report rather than just paying lip service to it. What would it take? At a time where CSRD is being challenged, at a
Yeah.
time where regulatory regimes are being, basically also challenged, what would it take to systematize that triangle of action and balance for the future for businesses?
Well, it's a great question, and thank you for it. I think several things. One is that CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is part of an increasingly bureaucratic response to the challenges that we now face. That doesn't mean that they're not important, and doesn't mean that they shouldn't be done. But what I'm seeing when I talk to chief sustainability officers and companies is these people saying we have no bandwidth to do anything but reporting. Now, if that's true, we have a major problem because we're just going into a
Yes.
period of systemic changes going and disruption and transformation, all this stuff is going to consume an enormous amount of our brain power and bandwidth and the rest of it. And if we're simply cranking out reports and more and
Hmm.
more and more and more of them, but then nobody's using the data, that's a complete distraction from what
Yes.
we should be doing. Now, I do think to the question, reporting is absolutely fundamentally important. I think increasingly we will see a lot of the reporting activities run by chiefs of financial officers,
Yep.
people of that ilk, and I think chief sustainability officers should have that in mind. How do we get all of this stuff properly integrated into financial accounting and reporting and so on? We still have quite a lot of work to do on that front. I think a lot of the triple bottom line implications, impacts, and all the rest of it are very hard to put a meaningful
Yes.
financial number on. I, we're making some progress on that, and some would argue that that's a complete distraction in itself. That if you're going to put a price on nature, God help us all. But
Yep.
I think a lot of this stuff has to be financialized if we're going to make it work in a
Yep.
market economy. I do think that AI actually could be a really important
Hmm.
part of all of this going forward. And I've just written a forward yesterday to a new report that's coming out on the use of AI in reducing corporate
Yes.
reports. And it's still early stage, I would say, but I think it's going to explode. The question in my mind is how do we make sure that AI is also used to, basically process all of that data and turn it into useful strategies and economic
Yes.
programs and all the
Yes.
rest of it. But yeah,
Yeah, I think we are still at the very beginning of that innovation, John. But I'm also, like you, a strong believer that actually data and AI, having a strong data actually integrity,
yeah,
is the starting point of any accounting initiative, any numbers initiative, and then you need to apply a strong sense of reality as well, based again on what your business is and where you're heading to. So I'd like to keep going. I know you've been a strong advocate for the B Corp movement
Yeah,
and the push for regenerative capitalism. Many see B Corps again as the next wave of new capitalism, or in your words, regenerative capitalism, which you introduce in the Green Swans books.
yeah.
Um, could you first of all define what regenerative, capitalism is all about, and how do you view again B Corps and the broader movement toward regenerative capitalism?
Well, I have friends, among them Paul Hawken, who wrote a book called Regeneration, who hates the phrase regenerative capitalism. He might be more relaxed about regenerative economies and so on. So if people firstly want to know more about what regeneration means,
Yeah.
I recommend that book, Regeneration by Paul Hawken, very powerfully indeed. To my mind, regeneration is often thought about as how do we restore and enable to recover seagrass meadows and
Mm.
tropical rainforests and so on. It's largely ecological. It's largely sort of looking at nature and wildlife. I think we have to think about regeneration right the way across the triple bottom line. So it has to be economic, it has to be social, it has to be environmental, it has to be political regeneration as well, because God help us, if we look around the modern democracies, they are
Mm.
not in a good state. And we can't just assume that they're going to find their feet again. History suggests that's exactly what won't happen.
Yes.
Go through a major conflict before it even has a chance of happening. So I think one of the things that interests my small company now, Volance, is the public policy activities of major
Mm.
companies and trying to get that corporate voice active and positive in influencing policy making and over time politics. It's very difficult because for a long time activists have hated the idea of
Yes.
business having any role in politics because we knew that if companies like Shell in Nigeria were doing that work, it probably on balance would not be in favor of what we would consider
Yes.
to be sustainability. But now
Yep.
we have no choice. And particularly with, sort of campaign finance rotting American
Yep.
politics, we've got to address that set of issues and quite rapidly. But again, I feel oddly that we can make quite a lot of progress in a relatively short period of time. But to your earlier question about what sort of
Mm.
shocks are needed, I think it's
Yes.
very dangerous when activists, whether they're environmentalists or human rights people or
Mm.
whatever, think what we need now is a really good shock. Instead
Mm.
of bits of Los Angeles burning down, we need all of Los Angeles burning down. My personal view is that'll make no difference. I mean, people will be upset and lose their homes, and the insurance and reinsurance industry will be agitated and so on, and they'll jack up premiums. But the shocks tend to get absorbed by the system. We're remarkably resilient and taking these things sort of and just think, oh, that's reality, and it's changing, but
Somewhere else. Yeah.
well,
Mm.
it's somebody else's problem. Um,
Yes.
so I think, in a sense, Buckminster Fuller, who had a huge impact on my thinking,
Mm.
once said that the only way to overturn a system is to create a better system that replaces it.
Mm.
And I think that now is the challenge, and it's happening. It's happening all over the place. So different people that you will be interacting with and supporting, lots of the people we're working with, they're helping create the building blocks of a new
Yes.
system. And the older I get, the more I feel much of my work now has to be with, if not startup, at least early stage, much more innovative businesses,
Innovators.
rather than just the big ones that are locked into
Yes.
the old system.
I'm with you, John. I'm so much learning, spending time with a bunch of young social entrepreneurs,
Yeah,
innovators, who are really designing, in a way, the new enterprise world, the new corporate world. And I think it's probably, I mean, it is the best time ever to create and design a business, a company that can actually drive economic strengths, social positivism, and also environmental impact. And if you design it in the right way from scratch, I think you'd be in a much better place 10 years later, 20 years later, than trying to retrofit the anti-legacy corporate world of
Yeah.
that exists today. And I know you know how hard it is to work with large companies, and I know as well what it means. But I think this new generation can actually ignite a lot of the changes by leading by example. At least that's my view.
And I
Uh,
think it doesn't mean that we shouldn't work with the bigger players.
no,
We have
no,
to continue doing that, but
no.
we should rebalance our work, our portfolios in a way towards some of the people we haven't yet heard of, and who are going to do great. I mean, you and I met through Matiga Solutions
Yes.
in Spain, and just one example of all of this. So, and I find the can-do spirit of these people immensely liberating and exciting, and it actually just gives me hope, and that's what we all need.
So, John, before we come back actually to a question from the Sea of Mitiga in a few minutes, I'd love you to talk about another exciting book that I had the opportunity to read again recently, Tickling Sharks, which is a memorable concept you coined, which suggests that speaking truth to power can provoke systems change. So, what is the most effective way to speak truth to power, especially when entrenched leaders and institutions are stuck in short term thinking? And how do you push them to embrace long term systemic changes?
Well, it would be, I think, a mistake and arrogant if any one individual felt they could do anything significant to push these
Hmm.
huge, great enterprises towards a sensible set of outcomes. But I think as catalysts, we can do a great deal to help people understand that there are a set of realities involving in the wider world which they may not yet be properly connected with. It may well be, and they'll often dismiss these people, the case that some of their younger people and some of the people in the outlying departments and so on are very well aware of what's going on, but unable to sort of pump this up to the sort of
Yeah.
board or C-suite level. So I think I've often felt that part of what I do is like a diplomatic uh,
Hmm.
function that I'm bringing the outside world into business at whatever level that happens, but equally trying to bridge between the different parts of the activist movement so that they better understand what each other is trying to do and
Yes.
wherever possible work together. And also increasingly now trying to bring all of that experience back into the world of education, universities, business schools, and so
Yes.
on. And just an example there. I mean, for 30 years now, I've lectured at Imperial College in London, the master's MSc course, and about 3 months ago, I got a request from Imperial College
Hmm.
to now called Imperial. I don't think it's great branding, but that, that is the fact. To come and launch a new school of sustainability. And I almost
Hmm.
clutched my head in my hands and thought, that's 20 years too late. And then they told me what they were actually doing, which was
Yeah.
they're setting up a school of convergent science. And
Hmm.
in that, they're looking at health, they're looking at security, they're looking at space, and they're looking at sustainability.
Hmm.
And they're going to pull all of the different resources of at least this is the thinking,
Together. Yeah.
different different departments breaking silos
Hmm.
across Imperial and making these people work together on solutions, systemic solutions in an integrated way, and that I love. And so
Hmm.
bridging back into the educational world, and then bringing
Yes.
some of the younger people into the world of business and all the rest of it. That I think is a key part of all of our
No,
tasks.
I think it's very strong actually to bring a multidisciplinary approach. I mean,
Yeah.
with environment and not segregate it as a silo, as a piece of culture or of veneration, but embed it into all the disciplines that you teach
But
in
Jean-Philippe,
schools.
where did this whole agenda first sort of present itself to you? Were you working with Microsoft at the time, or where did that happen, and how did it happen?
Well, it's a great question, John, and you are certainly turning the table now to me, which was not expected. It's okay. Tell the truth, certainly, working in such an exciting company at the core of the innovation ecosystem in the world, which is Microsoft,
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to see the power of innovation all across the world, traveling the world for 40 years of my life. And I could see the way that innovation could be actually translated into social progress, into environmental outcomes as well, in a
Hmm.
more sustainable way. And in all that time, I also love and enjoy always to meet with social entrepreneurs, impact entrepreneurs, this generation of people we are talking about, who are basically building new types of companies which are balancing together a strong direction in terms of financials and economics,
Hmm.
absolutely, but in service to to a cause, to an issue, to a problem that they want to solve. And that inspired me. And then later on, about 10 years ago, I created a foundation called Live for Good now in my country,
Yeah.
where I'm spending now, 50% of my time more spending time with youth between 18 and 30 years old, thinking about this new generation of companies and leaders as well. I call them positive leaders, hence the name of this podcast, Positive Leadership as well, to think about the future differently with a mindset which is a growth mindset, which is a mindset about the way each one of us can have a positive impact in the world in whatever we do. It could be running an NGO, it could be a volunteer in a sports club, it could be a consultant, it could be a CEO. You can have a positive impact around yourself with your behaviors and with your energy driving others with you to make the change where it needs to happen.
And just a very quick question. What's the mix in terms of young men and young women, in terms of the younger entrepreneurs and innovators that you're working with?
In the community I've been working on, John, it's been 50-50.
Okay,
It's been,
that's
and I didn't have to put any kind of a quota at all. It happened to be demographics, of
I
the
mean, I
country.
asked the question partly because in innovation you often find it's skewed
Yeah.
male, and with
Yes.
AI and things like that. In chief sustainability officers, it's heavily skewed female. So that's where the question came from. But
No,
it's
no, absolutely. But I think what I found out is in this universe of social entrepreneurs, impact entrepreneurs, you
hmm,
get actually a much broader access to entrepreneurship than the traditional
yeah,
startups ecosystem
yeah,
by far. And my goal now is actually to go far beyond just the gender, is to also include and invite all kind of diverse backgrounds to entrepreneurship, which we do actually with disadvantaged kids, with people coming from suburbs or rural areas, and give them access to the ecosystem, to the tools, to financial means as well, to build their own impact
yeah.
enterprise. So
Well,
anyway, that was
as,
a
as you struggle to bring in people from the banlieue and so on, remember to
yes.
bring in some of the older people as well. So,
Absolutely, with pleasure. So let's keep going because we are almost coming to an end,
yeah,
John. But before we come to the few last questions on leadership, I'd like to ask you a question again from another CEO of another impact startup, and you know him, Alejandro Marti. This is where we.
indeed, yeah.
This is actually the person who make us meet together. So
Hmm,
Alejandro Marti, for our listeners, is the CEO of Mitiga Solutions, which is a wonderful company whose mission is to make the world a more resilient place under a changing climate. So it provides basically climate risk intelligence that combines science, high performance computing, and AI all together. Alejandro points out that net zero goals often overshadow the pressing need for climate adaptation and resilience strategies.
yeah.
So here's this question to you, John. Are we neglecting resilience in our race to net zero? And how could actually this backfire, leaving businesses vulnerable to unavoidable climate impacts?
The simple answer is yes, we are.
Hmm.
And there are very good political reasons for that, alongside some very bad political reasons. And the good ones have been that, particularly people who are concerned about the scale of climate chaos that's coming at us, feel that if people start to focus mainly on adaptation, it'll take the priority off, it'll take the heat out or the energy out from the efforts to sort of prevent
Hmm.
climate chaos happening in the first place. but we've let it go on for so long now. We cannot but respond to the adaptation crisis, and we have to do that very urgently. And you look at most of the world's major cities, and they're based in coastal areas, and you look out 50 to 70 years, a
Yeah.
large part of those cities are technically underwater. I think the last time I looked at a map of Shanghai, 40% of the city goes underwater. The economic impact of that will be profound. The social consequences are already building all around us. I think one way to soften the political anxiety that comes around supporting adaptation is to
Yeah.
say one of the best ways that we can adapt our economies is by investing in nature-based solutions. So
Mm.
if New Orleans
Yeah.
had had mangrove swamps and so on, and they hadn't stripped them away and so on, the storm damage would have been massively buffered. If New York with Hurricane Sandy had had the oyster reefs that it once had, that they're now being rebuilt, um,
Yes.
again, they would have buffered the city against the chaos that
Mm.
happened. So I think my own personal interests have always been in nature, but I find
Yeah.
that side of all of this is coming up really, really fiercely. And I think you can put those two things together and have a positive story on both
Yeah.
adaptation, but also on let's build back the nature that we've actually managed so successfully to destroy. I
Hmm.
mean, what 73% of wildlife's disappeared in the last 50 years, exactly
Yes.
my working life. So when people say, "Are you happy with what you've done with your career?" I cannot say I'm.
Yes. So, you've been reflecting, of course, on what sustainability was 50 years ago.
Yeah,
Now, looking ahead to the next 50 years, John, I know it's daunting, of course, because now we're taking a full century since you started the journey.
yeah.
We have geopolitical challenges, of course, that are today impacting global sustainability efforts. And given the slow pace of adoption, again, in some regions, and again, all the geopolitical risk happening right now surrounding the Paris Agreement and more to come, where do you see the global sustainability efforts heading over the next 5 decades?
Well, that's a big one, and I think over 5 decades, the demographic shifts will be utterly profound. So younger people will come through at every level in our societies, and their impact on what the world thinks and what it prioritizes and how it acts
Yeah.
will be. We just don't have the means to understand at this stage what that's going to imply, but it's going to be profound. At the same time, as we all know, technology has reached a whole series of different inflection points. We see it most notably with solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles. But behind that,
Yes.
obviously AI, but precision fermentation, all sorts of things are on these extraordinary evolutionary trajectories. Now, I'm not a 100% technology enthusiast. I think technologies take us off on all sorts
Yes.
of adventures, many of them quite risky along the way. But I think science and technology will have a huge impact on all of that. The one thing I would just say, though, is that I read a book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, when I was 14. It was by
Mm.
Thomas Kuhn. I talk about it in Tickling Sharks. It just had such a huge
Mm.
impact on me because what he talked about was the way scientific paradigms shift. And one
Yeah.
of the things that I keep having to cross check was that one of the things he said is it takes 70 to 80 years for a scientific paradigm properly to shift.
Mm.
Well, I think we've talked about the timescale from 50s and 60s to the present day. We're about 70 years into a paradigm shift. So that if Kuhn was even broadly right, you would expect the next 10 to 15 years are going to see change. But what he also said was
Yeah.
change bumps along for a long, long, long time, and then suddenly it goes into an inflection point and goes berserk. And I think we're going to see off the scale
Hmm.
levels of change in the next 10 to 15 years, good, bad, and ugly. So when I think of 50 years, I encourage people to read as much science fiction, good,
Yes.
good and bad, to get their brains around what's coming at us. Because the fascinating thing is, science fiction is really starting to embrace these water scarcity, deforestation,
Yes.
future of urbanization, climate change, and so on issues in the most astonishingly interesting way. I just wish I was going to be around for the next 50 years because I think it's going to be incredibly challenging, but incredibly exciting.
No, super. So, as you just said, John, at the beginning of this episode, you said we are just getting started. But guess what? After those 50 years of starting, we are getting into action now in a big way. And the
We
next 10, 15 years are going to be very exciting for anyone who want to join forces to drive this positive change in the world. So that sounds like an exciting destination. Now, my last couple of questions on leadership,
yes.
because that's obviously the key theme, and I think what is needed to drive any change in the world. Today's rising leaders, entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, policymakers, and others who are eager to make an impact are often torn again between rapid scaling and responsible innovation. So if you are coaching today a rising leader, very eager to make a positive impact, whether again as a startup, as a business, as a government, what are the key lessons you would pass along?
Well, there are all sorts of standard leadership lessons. Be determined and have stamina and know what you're trying to do and prioritize and all of these good things. But
Yeah.
when you're moving into a period that is as disrupted as the next period of our future is likely to be, I think one of the things you're going to have to do is get out more. You're going to have to connect with people you wouldn't normally connect with. And,
Mm.
you may go and study civil engineering, you might go and do mathematics or whatever. It's always really difficult when you're in these sort of silos, as we've discussed earlier on, within the educational system to break out and talk to other people. But I think whatever stage of leadership you're at, and it's something I've done throughout my life, break out periodically, go and see people who are just interesting, doing other things, because it
Yes.
fuels your imagination, it
Yes.
fuels your sense of what's possible. So that's driven by curiosity, and you can't fake curiosity.
Yes.
You're
Mm.
born with it. You can develop it over time, but not everyone has it. So I try and select people to work with who um, have that curiosity. I also think there's something else, and it's something that Donald Trump singularly lacks, and that's a sense of humor.
Yes.
And I say that because, what's going to be thrown at us and what we're going to have to do is going to test us to the very limits of human ingenuity and perseverance and so on.
Yes.
Humor is not telling jokes. It's about having to deal with some of this stuff in a semi-playful way. And I feel that when I go into a top team environment in a company and there's no humor, I know I can't work with them. Uh, uh, but it is some sort of playfulness, and I know that they can think around corners. And oddly, if I recently had occasion to work with the British Armed Forces, so admirals, generals, and air marshals, and so on, and there was humour there, and I thought
Mm.
that's interesting. It's the last place you'd probably look for that. So I think all of that, and I think a generosity of spirit, in a sense that when things get very difficult, it's
Mm.
very human to withdraw, to retreat, to hunker
Yes.
down, to protect what you have. And I think we've got to go in exactly the opposite direction without being
Mm.
stupid, but we've got to recognize that we need to serve not just our current stakeholders, we've got to serve the future and ask
Mm.
ourselves continuously, how is that best done? And how would I know? How would we know? Who might know? And then go out and talk to those people and get a better sense. And that will include politicians, but it will include people like philosophers. I mean, poets, all sorts of people starting with a P.
What a wonderful almost closing, because my last usual question, John, is the following. How would you personally define a positive leader? in the context of sustainability again and systemic change?
I think I would say that the sort of leaders who would have a strongly net positive impact over their working careers tend to be people who do not feel expert. I mean, yes, you can have expertise, but they're constantly on a learning curve,
Yes.
and they actually enjoy that process, and they know that they can't just get that from books or from websites or from even AI. It's got to be through conversation. It's got to be through non-executive directors on their boards who bring very different insights and perspectives and experience to bear, advisory boards, whatever, learning journeys, studying tours, getting out of their cages to engage the wider world. But I would say that it comes back continuously, that interest in going up learning curves and the ability to do so.
Fantastic, John. It's been a wonderful discussion. If I think about some of the key takeaways, it's about being curious. It's about having humor as well, which you have a lot of. I can relate to that. It's about meeting with very diverse people as well to have different conversations and getting out there. It's also, I think, about resisting to the tyranny of or, so that you can run multiple bottom lines, not just as a business, but as a citizen, as a consumer as well. So, John, again, thank you so much for this inspiring conversation, exciting conversation. I think there's been a lot of wisdom shared across 50 years and more to come, actually. And to our listeners, we hope that, of course, not only you found this episode thought-provoking, that you enjoyed, and that you're going to leave some nice comments as well on the different platforms. Please feel free to give a 5-star review as well. That helps to get more people to listen. And of course, don't forget to tune in in 2 weeks for the next episode. In the meantime, again, thanks so much, John, for this incredible moment. And looking forward to be with you in person again in the future.
I know that you're headed towards an end, but if I may say, thank you so much for doing this podcast series, and having heard how you do this, I'm going to dive back into some of the historic episodes. Thank you again.
Thanks, John, and have a great day.
You too.